very much for attending today's webinar, A Guru or the Gang, the 4 Methods of Social Media Agency Staffing. I am the host for today's webinar. I am Jay Baer from Convince and Convert, social media accelerator firm. The website and blog is convinceandconvert.com. We also have a daily email newsletter with the one important thing that you need to know that day about social media. It's at onesocialthing.com. And I'm co-author of the best-selling social business book, The Now Revolution. Now, because this particular webinar was brought to you by the good folks at agencyside, I believe that some of you will be joining us for BOLO in Scottsdale, Arizona on October 7th through 9th, the single best agency conference in this country. I will be speaking there and doing a brand new presentation all about content marketing. I'm really excited about it. An amazing lineup of speakers at BOLO as well. Also, it's a small enough conference where people can really interact. Tons of great agency folks in attendance. It's going to be fantastic. If you use the promo code JBEAR, B-A-E-R, JBEAR200, you can go to BOLO 2012 and save yourself $200 today. So if you're not already signed up for BOLO, I really suggest that you go. You will have an absolutely fantastic time and learn a lot of actionable stuff. Promo code JBEAR200, and we'll see you in Scottsdale. Okay, here are my 3 rules for client relations. Rule number 1 is that the greater the pace of change, the greater the client interface requirement. The more frequently things change, the more frequently things are manipulated in a particular vertical or a particular industry, the more the client needs to be counseled, have their hand held by the agency, the more touches they want to have with the agency about that particular topic. Second rule, the greater the measurable granularity, the greater the client interface requirement. So for things that are inherently difficult to measure, like broadcast, like outdoor, there's only so many conversations you can have with the client about the measurability of those particular tactics. But when you have tactics that are inherently measurable, that are inherently optimizable, then in many cases the client wants to talk through all those options, and perhaps rightfully so. Third rule, and this of course is the visual representation of this. Oh, hold on just a sec. I guess we're having some visual problems. Give me just a moment and I will fix this. Sorry, stay tuned. There we go. That should be better on the visuals. Let me know if that is okay. Nathan, want to send me a chat message there. Nathan, let me know if that's okay. Apparently it's not okay. All right, stay tuned. Sorry, folks. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, I'll tell you the story, and just because you're agency folks, you'll appreciate this. When Mac rolled out the new MacBook Pro with the Retina display, I of course went and got one because I'm a social media guy and that's what I do, and I'm an Apple guy. when they decided to do the Retina display, they're like, hey, we're Apple, we don't care. We're just going to make this the best possible screen of all time. And I got to tell you, if you haven't seen one, it is ridiculous, right? It is unbelievably sharp. Holding it next to my old MacBook Pro is really, it's like Lamborghini versus covered wagon. It's crazy. But they didn't go to the trouble of doing any sort of compatibility checks. So when you use GoToMeeting, or in this case GoToWebinar, with the new MacBook Pro, it absolutely messes it up. So I actually have to present this webinar from my other monitor, my second monitor, which I forgot to do when we set up the show, so I apologize for that. And apparently GoToMeeting is working on a software fix for it, because every single person who used GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar with the new Macintosh, the new MacBook, I should say, is having that problem. So, interesting fun fact. Okay, so we talked about when you have measurable granularity that clients need to talk about that, and this is the visual representation. The clients now want to see sausage being made, and for some of you who are involved in digital, I'm sure that you have had this experience, right? That they want to pour over every subject line report of email marketing or every keyword report of your paid search program. They just want to see the details because the details actually exist. Third rule for client relations is that the more familiar the tactic, the greater the client wants to talk about it. The more familiar the tactic, the greater they want to talk about it, because they feel that they have some sort of inherent understanding of what makes that particular tactic a success, or what makes that tactic good. Okay? You know what clients don't want to talk about very much? Interactive kiosks, because they don't know anything about interactive kiosks. They don't know anything about skywriting. But what they do want to talk about are things like this. Facebook. Why? Because in Facebook and in social media, the tools and tactics we use for business are the same tools and tactics that we use for personal. This is my Facebook newsfeed. I actually pulled this right off the newsfeed a couple weeks ago. My friend Chris Moody, followed by a company, followed by my wife, followed by another company, right? That's literally how the newsfeed is. It's friend, company, family member, company, and so clients feel like, oh, we understand this inherently because I'm on Facebook all the time, or I'm on Twitter, or I use LinkedIn, or I watch YouTube videos, ergo, I must know how to do this, therefore I need to talk to my agency representation about that all the time. So here's what we have. In social media, it is ever-changing. I think we can stipulate to that. That's why I have a daily email newsletter about what's going on in social media, because literally there is something to publish every day. Social media is ever-changing. It is, in fact, granularly measurable. We've talked about that in other webinars that I've done for agencyside, but certainly social media is inherently measurable. And if people tell you that it's difficult or impossible to measure, they're telling you the wrong things. And as we just talked about, social media is tactically familiar. We're using the same stuff for business that we use for personal. So what this ends up being is sort of the perfect storm of client interface requirements, right? That clients want to talk about social media all the time, okay? And I guess that's a good news scenario, unless you happen to be the social media manager in your agency. If you are the social media person in your agency, you start off all happy and balanced like this, and it's all good. And then you realize that every single client and every single account team and every single new business prospect needs to talk to you about social media. And that's when this happens, right? That's when that person becomes extraordinarily stressed, okay? Let me tell you a couple of truths that I've observed having worked with now dozens and dozens of agencies in North America on social media issues. A couple of truths. One, show me a firm where the social media people are not the busiest in the agency, and I will show you an agency that is not very good at selling social media. If you have any social media business development capabilities at all, what you will find is very quickly your social media people are extraordinarily busy. All they do is go to meetings. Second truth, social media is much more about doing than it is about making. There is no business model in constructing Facebook pages. There is no business model in setting up a LinkedIn page for your client. There maybe is a business model a little bit on contests and promotions, but generally speaking, social media is more like public relations than it is like advertising, right? Where it's more of a sustained effort than it is a big production budget or a website design budget, that kind of thing. Third truth, social media, similar to paid search, search engine marketing, Google AdWords, those kind of things, is really largely rooted on the agency side in arbitrage. It's just arbitrage. The question is, can you do more or better work for your client than she can do with either internal resources at a cost that allows her to justify that, right? So can you do social media for your client cheaper than the client can do it for themselves? Okay, so if you're going to actually play this arbitrage game as an agency, there's only 3 ways to make money at this, right? There's only 3 ways to profit from arbitrage. One is to sell the black box, to say, okay, client, look, yeah, you could probably hire somebody to do your social media in-house, but we have the quote-unquote methodology. We have the secret sauce. We have the elephant in the room. We've got the gorilla. We've got the expertise. We have something that you don't have. Therefore, you should pay us more than what you would have to pay to do this in-house. Okay, so that's the black box sale. The reality is that the black box sale is difficult to pull off in social media because, as we just looked at a few slides ago, clients are using the same tools themselves that we're trying to sell them for business. So it's a little bit hard to say, we've got this amazing thing that you've never heard of or you've never seen that you should pay a lot for, because the reality is they've actually experienced a lot of those things themselves in their own personal use of social media. The second way to profit from arbitrage is to create a true economy of scale. And what you're seeing now is a lot of agencies trying to become larger social media pure play agencies, the same way we saw larger digital agencies get aggregated a few years ago. Now you're seeing big social media agencies, Likeable Social Media, VaynerMedia. There's several others that are trying to bulk up so that they have 100, 200, 300, 400 people on staff only doing social media for corporate clients. And at that point, when you have that many clients and that many opportunities, you can actually create an economy of scale so that you can offer services less expensive than clients can do it themselves. But most agencies, including I suspect many if not all of you on today's webinar, will not have that many social media people ever, right, to really get an economy of scale. So the third option, and frankly the one that most of us are engaged in today, is to purchase cheap labor, prop it up, and sell it for more. So you bring in somebody who's fairly inexperienced. You don't pay them a ton of money because, after all, it's the agency business, and he or she's only 24, so what do you expect? And you make sure that you sort of burnish their credentials and you give them a lot of social media projects to work on so that you can credibly say to your client, he or she really knows what she's doing in this category, so we're going to go ahead and bill that person out at $175 an hour or $125, whatever the market is, and you're going to be able to actually make money at that arbitrage game. Okay? That's it. Those are the 3 ways to do it. So the 3 success factors for you of whether or not you can really make that work are these. 1, what social media services you sell. One of the best ways to make money at social media is to expand your definition of what social media services you have available. Make your menu bigger. We did a webinar with agencyside earlier this summer called the 23 social and digital services you should be selling but probably aren't. And you can actually access that on SlideShare at that URL, or just go to SlideShare and type in JBear and you will find it. The second way you can increase your success factors here is to sell your services better, right? To package, price, sell, convince, convert, just do a better job in the social media business development and opportunity closing side of the business. And that's certainly something that we'll talk about more at the BOLO conference. And the third option that really drives success factors is how are your resources structured, right? If a lot of this social media game is about arbitrage, right, is about taking resources, using them efficiently, and therefore using them profitably, how those resources are structured within your agency is a huge determinant on whether social media is profitable inside your agency. So that's what we're going to talk about here today. Specifically, there are 4 methods of staffing social media in agencies. Now, as I mentioned, we work with lots of agencies all around North America on retainer. In many cases, we also do agency business plans. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of today's webinar, but we have worked with a lot of different agencies from 10 employees to 150 employees, some that are PR focused, some that are ad focused, some that are digital focused, some that are truly integrated. And so when we put together these 4 methods of social media agency staffing, it's based on our experience looking at and working with a lot of different agencies. And I suspect that all of you on today's webinar will find yourselves in one of these 4 categories. Method 1 is the outsource model. Okay, that's where we say, you know what, we don't have the capabilities or the gumption or the appetite to do this ourselves yet. And so you take your firm and you find some specialty firms, some social media firms, some social media consultants, a guy down the street, whatever the circumstances may be, you find somebody to handle this for you. This is the same way that a lot of agencies originally began to provide digital services, whether it was web design or email marketing or SEO or anything else. They went out of house, developed some sort of partnership with a third party to provide those services to your clients. Okay? Sounds familiar, I suspect. So there are some pros and cons for each of these methods. Let's take a look at the pros and cons for the outsourcing method. Well, the good news is that you can ramp up pretty quickly. All you have to do is cut a deal with somebody in your marketplace, and now you have the ability to provide those services. The bad news, of course, is lack of control. You don't really have end-to-end control over the provision of those services because they're not being done by your employees. Theoretically, because you're going to work with a specialty firm, you're going to have access to best-of-breed resources. The reality is that those resources are not always best-of-breed, because what I find agency owners typically do is work with somebody who is familiar because they happen to be in your same market or because you're in Rotary together or something else. It's not necessarily best-of-breed, it's just best-of-familiar. The other downside is slim margins, right? So if you're going to work with a specialty firm, they have to make money too. So typically what happens is by the time you pass it through, mark it up a little bit, but then account for your account management time, it ends up being a wash, right? I've seen very, very, very few circumstances where agencies can develop true profit margin on an ongoing basis through this type of outsourcing. One of the pros potentially is that it's a bi-directional revenue pass. So you hire the specialty agency to do social media, and in turn, the social media agency throws work your way to do public relations or advertising or websites or whatever it is that you specialize in. The reality is I don't often see that happening, that usually it becomes a one-way street because presumably you're the bigger agency, but it certainly can happen, and that is in the pro column. One of the downsides is that the end user, your client, can have a lot of client touch points, because in most cases when you outsource, you also outsource at least some measure of the account management, and so now your client has to deal with the people in your company and also has to get familiar with people from the other company, and that can get a little bit of a sticky wicket sometimes. On the positive category is education. A lot of times you can go to school, so to speak, and learn some best practices from these third parties and really train your team so that eventually maybe you can bring it back in-house. The bad news, of course, is that from a reputation standpoint, as social media becomes more and more important and becomes baked into more and more client engagements, clients start to say, geez, how come these guys can't do social media themselves? How come they have to use a third party? What does that mean about their skill set as an agency overall? And so sometimes can call into question the agency's sort of capabilities in terms of cutting-edge marketing tactics. The second method is also probably quite familiar. It's the guru or gurus method, right? So that's where you have all of your agency personnel, your account teams, your account managers, your account directors, other people that might be in the provision of specific services of your industry. Maybe they're project managers or they're web developers or they're SEO people, whatever they do. You have all these people in your agency, and they interface with your internal specialist, your internal guru, your social media manager, your social media director, your vice president of digital, whatever that title may be. It's that person in the middle who solves all the social media problems and provides all the social media services. Now, this is where that person lies, right? And again, this person starts off super psyched. I am really honored to be the vice president of digital for agency XYZ. This is a great job. It's going to be fantastic. And then this person realizes that every single person in the agency needs them to work on their account. And that's what happens, right? It is a method that seems amazingly good on paper, but as you get more successful at selling social, it starts to fray a little bit, I find, in execution, because the person becomes really, really busy. And even if you have 2 or 3, and that's usually what happens, right? You start off with one social media guru, and then they get super duper busy. They're like, hey, I got to hire another guru. I have to hire a junior guru, or I have to hire a suite of junior gurus. And then all of a sudden, you're sort of empire building. And you say, geez, do we want to have a whole social media department? I mean, we don't have a radio department. We don't have a press release department. Do we need a whole social media department? You start to have these kind of conversations, which is why hopefully you're attending this particular webinar. Okay? So, not all bad news though. There's definitely pros and cons of the guru model. Pros are very easy to implement, right? It's like, okay, we hire somebody and that person hopefully is smart enough to make our pain go away. The bad news, and I'm sure some of you are seeing this already, is that talent attraction has become a real problem. This is very much where we were at with web programmers a few years ago, where it is absolutely a job hunter's market, right? And if you are super good at social media, you can probably go get a high-paying corporate job that may be more attractive than almost any agency job, right? So the talent attraction side of this can be a little difficult. Easy to hire somebody if you can actually get them hired. One of the other pros is that you have a defined go-to person in the agency, right? Social media, you go to Jack, right? That's a pretty easy way to handle it. But then what happens is you get some of that empire building that I mentioned a moment ago, that Jack gets busy and Jack hires some minions, and all of a sudden now you have this whole empire. And one of the things I found is that, and this isn't categorically true, okay, so this may not be true in your case, but in many cases, the people who are social media managers, digital managers, and agencies came from an execution background, right? And they got that job because they're good at executing. A lot of those people do not have management experience. They have not had a staff. They have not had a bunch of people working for them in the past. And so sometimes I find that when these empires get built and all of a sudden Jack hires some minions, then we see whether Jack is actually a good manager or just a good strategist and tactician, right? So it's not always the same thing, as you well know. And then, of course, there's some risk involved too, right? If you hire a guru and the guru leaves, now you're sort of back to square one, which I'm sure, well, I know for a fact happens quite often, and hopefully it hasn't happened to you. One of the other pros is that sometimes these social media digital gurus don't have agency background, right? They came from the client side in many cases, and they did a great job for the clients. Now they decided to go the agency route. And that can also be a con, because as you know, working in an agency is vastly unlike working on the client side in terms of the number of balls you have to keep in the air, the number of things you have to juggle, the number of meetings and process, and you just have to know a lot about a lot. And so sometimes not understanding how agencies function can be a little bit of a setback initially when you bring a guru on board. Certainly you would hope that a guru would have tremendous depth of knowledge, and usually those people who are brought in as social media managers or digital managers are particularly good at one of the sub-tactics within that category. So usually they're really, really good at email, or they're really, really good at social, or really, really good at search, something along those lines, or really, really good at online media buying. But what we find is that their breadth of knowledge sometimes isn't perhaps as widespread as you might think, because they really have been, in many cases, tactical and been very good at a particular tactic or set of tactics. Sometimes they don't know the entire sweep of social and digital. And so what happens is that their recommendations for clients can sometimes be driven by what they've experienced in the past. You sort of get this head in the sand syndrome where it's like, look, I know what works because I've done it in the past, and I know that email is really effective, so I'm going to try and push email into every client opportunity instead of being tactically agnostic and saying, look, I don't care what we sell as long as we sell something that works for the client. Now, again, that's not always true either, and there's many, many, many fantastic social and digital managers out there, but that's certainly something that I have seen in the past. The third method is to come up with topical experts within your own staff. Okay, so what happens here is you still have your social guru or social gurus in the middle, But instead of them providing the actual social media services directly, what they do is facilitate the provision of social services from within your existing agency structure. So what you do is you train people within your agency on specific disciplines of social and digital. So for example, you would have, usually the guru handles strategy and planning, but then you would have a couple people in your company who are trained and really work on social analytics. You'd have a couple people who are trained and really work on community management. You have a couple people who are trained and really work on social listening. You have a couple people who are trained and really work on social contests and social promotions. You have a couple people who are trained and really work on influencer outreach. So you take the entire swath of social, and to some degree digital, and you break it up and assign or ask for volunteers is really the best way, within the agency and say, look, we're going to create a community management team, a small group of people in the agency who really focus on the provision of those services under the direction of our social media guru. Does that make sense? Sort of a hybrid approach, okay, where you have some in-house expertise, but that person isn't doing all the work. They're directing other people to do the work. Now, important to note that these small groups are comprised of people who actually have another job, right? So it's not as if we're saying you've got two people in your company who do nothing but social analytics. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that you've got two people in your company who do social analytics when it needs to be done, but also have a regular job. Maybe they're an account manager, maybe they're an account director, maybe they're an account coordinator, maybe they're an assistant account coordinator, maybe they're an SEO person, maybe they're a copywriter, maybe they're a whatever they happen to be, okay? So they have a function in the agency, and on top of that function, they go deep on some facet of social media. Let's look at the pros and cons of that approach. The good news is that it uses existing resources well, right? You're using the people that you already have and putting them into a different category, okay? So an efficient use of who you've got. The bad news is that the implementation of that can take a while because you have to train people, right? You have to say, look, we need to get you competent in this particular category of social, and that can take a while and require some resources to do. One of the good sides of this is you have less of a bottleneck. When everything doesn't run through the guru or small group of gurus, you have a more flexible structure for getting things accomplished in the agency. The bad news, though, is when you have lots of different people in the company working on different parts of social media, you have to really pay attention to your workflow and your communication. Everybody has to know which particular type of social each person is responsible for. You probably have to document it in chart form so that everybody can look at it at a glance. It just puts a lot of pressure on making sure that people communicate seamlessly. You can end up with very deep topical expertise if you say, look, we're not asking you to be a social media expert. We're asking you to be a social listening expert. Okay, that's a much smaller ask and a much more viable program for a lot of people, so they can get deep. They can really spend their time thinking about one particular piece of this pie and getting good at that. The bad news sometimes is that if you have an agency that's structured either vertically or by specific account teams, so let's say you've got 5 account teams in your agency. This happens more often in a public relations setting than it does in an advertising setting, but let's say you've got 5 different account teams and your account team has 3 people on it, and one of your 3 people is social analytics, and one is contests, and one is influencer outreach, and all of a sudden you need something else. You have to then cross over to another account team to get expertise from those people. So sometimes the way those hours get accounted and the way those teams work together can be a little bit cumbersome, because a lot of times those account teams function autonomously, right, as individual sort of battlefield units. And when you set this up, you're not going to be able to cover every social media service or every social media component within an individual account team. So that's something to think about. Certainly it minimizes risk because you're not empire building. And even if your guru were to leave, hopefully you've got enough expertise now from some of these category experts that you can say, you know what, this person has true aptitude. We could elevate them to the next guru, right? They could take over in a pinch, that sort of battlefield promotion, don't let the flag hit the ground. They could be that next guru. One of the negatives, though, is that it tends to pigeonhole the staff. So maybe you've got somebody who really starts off wanting to do social analytics. They like spreadsheets. They like math. And then 6 months, 9 months down the road, they're like, you know what, I feel like I know enough about this to be dangerous. I want to learn something else. Okay, how do you handle that? Do you let them go learn something else, and do you backfill that spot on the social analytics team, or what's the best way to address that? There is no right answer there, but I've seen circumstances where after a while people want to start to shift roles. Let's talk about the fourth option, which is the gang. This is where you actually train everybody on how to do everything in social media. You do not have a guru. Everybody on your team is expected to understand enough about social media to be dangerous across the entire swath of social media, and everybody provides social media services when and how they need to provide it for their own clients and their own client circumstances. This is certainly an option in some agencies. In other agencies, it's perhaps unrealistic just because of the size and type of agency that they are. But as social media becomes more and more important, and as we said, more and more often baked into the overall client circumstance, you're starting to see more companies try and handle this approach and to say, look, social media is just part of your job the same way that typing is part of your job, the same way that being able to communicate in a meeting is part of your job. Let's look at the pros and cons of that approach. Certainly it fully integrates social, right? This is the holy grail of integration. That is, I think, without question, the best way to do it in theory. Certainly the implementation is lengthy because you've got to get a lot of people good at a lot of things. Again, no bottleneck. In fact, no bottleneck at all. When everybody can do social with relative complexity, you have, by definition, no bottleneck. You also have no leadership, right? You don't have that one person that you can point to and say, that's the person we trot into the meeting to get the client excited. You just don't have that piece of it. You have very good margin in that environment because you're not paying for that centralized role. But you can have pretty high training costs because you have to keep a lot of people up to speed on a lot of facets of social media. And of course, as we've looked at, social changes all the time. So it's not like you can just train them once a year and be done with it. You got to keep them up to speed over the, every month kind of basis, which can be a little bit complex and expensive. Very flexible, but sometimes you can get a little bit of groupthink, right? Because you don't have that one leader to say, you know what? We need to think about this differently. Sometimes you find that people, when they tackle this model, tend to all start thinking the same way. This is how we should do this service. This is how we should do that service, which can be difficult over the long run because I think you don't get the same kind of refresh of ideas that you might get otherwise. So we've talked about four models, right? We've got the outsourcing model. We have the guru model, we have the account teams model, and we have the fully integrated model. And so the question becomes, well, which of these is right for your particular agency? And certainly there are factors here beyond those that I'll show you in a minute. There are factors around size of agency. There are factors around type of client. There's factors around how technology and social media savvy is your agency today. There are factors around what do you actually sell and to whom and for how much. But I think from a baseline perspective, this has been my experience in the past. For your first foray into social, right? So if you haven't really done a lot of social media so far, or you're getting ready to get serious about it, typically what we see is that the outsourced model is the first method to tackle. And it makes sense, right? Let's get our feet wet by seeing how somebody else does it and kind of get familiar with the process of selling social media services. And usually that outsourced model is 180 days or so in duration, or should be. And then after that, it's like, you know what, we've learned enough that we can take this back in-house and apply one of the other three methods. For agencies that are relatively small, what we usually see is the guru model. Somebody in the agency is the designated social media manager to handle all the social media issues in the agency. When you are that small, usually it scales pretty well. It doesn't get to the point where the guy starts crying, like I showed you in the slide a little while ago. Usually that can work. Typically in that scenario, though, the guru is not a full-time social media person. A lot of times it is somebody who is an account director or a vice president or something along those lines, and is also the designated social media guru. Usually agencies of that size don't sell enough social media to afford a full-time guru. So usually it's sort of part-time guru in the 5 to 10 employee category. For 11 to 30 employees, for those that are public relations focused, where you have more of a consistency of what you sell and the type of day-to-day activities in which you engage, for 11 to 30 employees for PR, we often see the gang, right, which is where everybody integrates and everybody does social. It's just part of your job. And I think just as a matter of course, social media is more similar to traditional public relations than it is to traditional advertising. And that's why we see the gang more often in the 11 to 30 employees for agencies that are more PR focused. For agencies of the same size that are more advertising focused, we typically see either the one or more guru model. For agencies that have a digital focus, we typically see the topical expert model, where some people are good at analytics and some people are good at community management. And that's because that's really how most digital agencies are set up. You have some people who do emails, some people who do banner ads, people who do search, some people who do paid search, etc., some people who do web design. So it's a familiar construct for agencies of that type, so that's usually why we see that. For bigger agencies, say 31 and larger, usually we see topical experts for either the PR focus or the advertising focus. We start to have these small teams that come together and say we're the analytics team, or we're the community manager team, or we're the contest and promotions team. And then for agencies that have a digital focus, as they get larger, we oftentimes see them switch to the guru model, where you have a vice president that handles, or director that handles social media primarily, with some actual tactics executed by individual staff members on that team. So you would have a social media department within the digital agency. Again, your results may vary, but that's what we have seen in the past. As mentioned, we do a lot of this kind of work. Convince to Convert does on-call advisory services for agencies, where we work on a retainer basis with lots of agencies to help them not only with these staffing issues, but sort of take their social media and digital services from good to great. We help with business development proposals. We help with ideas and RFPs. We do social and digital business planning for agencies, so help them figure out what services to sell and for how much, etc. Then we do a lot of social media training for agencies as well. For more information on all that kind of stuff, go to ar.gy/agencyside, and you can check that out. Also, last plug for our friends at Bolo. Really hope to see you there. It's going to be amazing. Use the discount code JBEAR200 and save yourself $200, which is fantastic. I hope you have enjoyed today's webinar. I actually really enjoyed putting this one together. It forced me to put a lot of things that we work on into one presentation, so it was a good experience for me, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. I don't see a lot of education about this topic out there in the marketplace, so I'm glad that agencyside asked me to put it together. I enjoyed it. Hope you did too. I think we've got a little time for questions. Put them into the chat box or the questions box, and I will answer them if you like. Thanks. Here's a question. Any idea about the percentages of agencies who use Method 3 versus Method 4 from Nan Dawkins? Hi, Nan. All I can tell you is a percentage of the agencies that I work with. Okay, so that is a non-scientific sample size. In my experience, it's probably 60% guru, probably 25% small teams, and 15% everybody is trained to understand it. That'd be a great survey for Agencyside to work on. Yeah, that's a good idea. We should work on that. Here's a question from Susan Berry. I'm planning to grow my marketing consulting business to include more staff Any thoughts on strategically growing into one of these models? Yeah, absolutely. If you're gonna be able to tackle one of these models as you grow, I would probably opt for model 3 from that perspective, where as you bring more people onto your team, as you bring more people into your company, to actually assign them to different categories of social media at that time. So when you bring them aboard, say, hey, in addition to doing whatever we want you to do, how do you feel about really learning influencer outreach, right? So you're sort of building those teams as you bring them on board, as opposed to after they're already in the agency, which is usually how we have to do it. Here is a question from Avon Klein. Do you have any examples of what small to mid-sized agencies are charging for full-on management? I think what you mean by that is management of all social outposts and social communication on behalf of the client, which typically would include Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. Certainly there's a fairly wide range there, but for small and mid-sized agencies, what we usually see is somewhere in the $400 to $9,500 range a month for full-on social media management. From my man Nate Riggs. Hi Nate, looking forward to seeing you next week. In the guru scenario, how have you seen internal education programs go? Do they typically succeed, and do you have any recommended formats for training across the organization? Yes, I mean I think that's one of the things that often falls by the wayside, right? When the guru gets really busy, which inevitably happens, a lot of times what falls by the wayside is the guru's ability to train the rest of the staff, right? So it's like, geez, I really ought to do this professional development session for the rest of the agency so they know what the newest Facebook changes are, or the importance of Instagram, or whether Google Plus is worthwhile, or whatever the circumstance is. But I don't have time to do that this week, month, quarter, year, because I have to do this RFP response, client pitch, strategic plan, fill in your own blanks. And so that I find is a difficult thing for a lot of gurus to execute on. So from that perspective, what usually happens is agencies turn to third-party training, and certainly as a provider of that, we're okay with that trend. But one of the things that I think is really important is to commit to ongoing training of the staff, right? It's so easy to say, look, let's just talk about social, once every 6 months, and the reality is it just changes too often. There's just too many new things. I mean, you can do that for PR and you can do it for other sides of the business, but in social it just changes too fast, unfortunately. Let's see. I'm looking through these questions here. Any suggestions for sources for ongoing training in digital and social? Jane, agencyside, and HubSpot. Yeah, so we do this, of course. Agencyside does all kinds of training for agencies. Fantastic. Paul Retzer's company does a lot of ongoing agency training. Some really, really good stuff out there. There's some great blogs as well. There's other companies that have ongoing social media education opportunities. So Social Fresh has an institute that you can participate in. Social Media Explorer has an institute that you can belong to. Neither of those are agency focused, so probably I would suggest that you look at an agency focused one first, just because you're going to get a little more applicability in that regard. Steve Walkemuth asks, any ideas on successful recruiting methods? I tell you, it's really hard. What I think you typically find is when agencies are successful at recruiting, true social media gurus to their practice, it's not going to be money. It's going to be lifestyle, right? And so it's typically somebody who wants to be back in the agency environment because the corporate environment was too boring, or somebody who already has an experience with the agency. So this is going to sound paradoxical, but what I've found in practice is that most of the agencies who've been successful at this have hired people who already knew the agency, who were former clients, or who used to work at the agency when they were a kid and then went out and got good at social and now they want to come back. That kind of circumstance. This idea of, hey, let's just put out a job reco and put it out on some sort of job board and hope for the best. I just don't see a lot of good results there. It's not to say it can't happen. I just personally haven't seen a lot of results there. using the guru method, how many accounts is one community manager in charge of? That's a good question, Evan. I think it depends on what community management entails. If we're talking about what I sort of mentioned earlier, so managing the Facebook page, managing the Twitter account, etc. If you're going to use regular social media best practices for publishing frequency, so a couple times a day on Twitter, a couple times a day on Facebook, and maybe 4 or 5 times on Twitter, I think you can probably have one person deal with 3, 4 accounts, something like that, if you do it well. Obviously, it depends on how much reactive posting you need to do. I mean, if you're getting in the business of doing real-time social listening and customer service triage, right? That's a different kettle of fish entirely. Because if you are really functioning as that company's social media telephone, if you will, then you don't want to stretch that person too thin, because if all of a sudden a crisis breaks out and you weren't around to handle it because your account coordinator is working on 4 other clients at the same time, you're not going to have that client very long. So what I always tell my agency clients is the more important social media is to your client, the fewer people you need to put on it and the more you need to charge, because you do not want to be caught in a circumstance where you just understaffed it, right? And what sucks about social is you never know when it's, when the crisis is going to break out, when all of a sudden, the iron is going to get hot. That's the nature of it. Josh Krakauer asks an interesting question. In your experience, Jay, do you see community management and tactically focused agencies having a higher failure rate than strategy and consulting focused agencies? That's a super good question. I've never pondered that. I should write a blog post about that, or you should write one for me, Josh. I think it's too early to say. I don't know that we have enough time in the saddle to make that call. And if it is true, or if there's a kernel of truth in the thought that tactically focused agencies in social have a higher failure rate than strategically focused agencies, I think it would only be because the margin is so tight, right? Like we said, it's an arbitrage play. And if social is an arbitrage play and all you are doing as a service is arbitraging social, you don't have anything else to sell, that is, I don't think it's an indictment of the tactical model. I just don't think it's a very good business, right? There's also a reason why there's a lot of failure in the web design business, right? Because it's really hard to make money at that, which is why I don't do that anymore. I think we're going to send these slides out too. We'll make sure the agency side folks email these slides out after the webinar, and we've got it recorded and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to go back and take a peek at it, please do. All right, everybody, I'm going to get out of here. Thanks so much. I appreciate your time and attention. As always, hope to see you at BOLO. If not, catch me at convinceandconvert.com, onesocialthing.com. Take care. I'm Jay. Cheers.